$1.36 billion that was on the line. And Keller Williams said, we're settling. They settled for $78 million back at the beginning of February. And finally, NAR settled. Okay? And NAR settled for $418 million, which will be paid over 4 years. So the only defendant that is still out there battling this lawsuit is Home Services. But it's not only money that these settlements encompass. It included certain provisions that really are why we're here today. If it was only money, we wouldn't be talking. One of the parts of the agreement, the settlement agreement, is that all buyer agents will get a buyer agency agreement signed before showing any properties to a buyer. Mandatory written buyer agency agreements for all NAR members. A second thing is that participation rule that I mentioned before in the MLS, that's going to disappear. Listing agent will no longer be able to submit anything as to what the seller is going to offer a buyer's agent, if anything, because they could offer zero. But there's not going to be a place in any MLS that is broker controlled, realtor controlled. Nowhere will you see that. Now, non-broker MLSs, non-realtor MLSs, I should say, do not have to comply with this. Like Bright and several others in New Jersey, they are not controlled by a board. But there is an option as part of the settlement for them to opt in and be covered by the settlement, and there's a formula for them to pay. And I suspect that most of them will opt in rather than take the chance on the exposure of a multi-billion-dollar judgment against them. But that remains to be seen. The time for them to opt in has actually started, the period, and so, but I expect most of them will opt in, if not all of them. But the bottom line for you is, you're not likely to be able to have anything in the MLS that shows what a seller or listing agent is offering as compensation for buyer's agent. This settlement will go into effect mid to late July. The final actual date has not been set, and NAR has said mid to late July. And I will tell you that the court has already, last Tuesday in fact, given preliminary approval to the settlement. So it is likely to happen. It's now only subject to members of the class opting out if they want to. They don't want to be part of the settlement, get part of the distribution. Not likely to happen with too many sellers. They're more likely to say, I'll take my check, thank you very much. I'm not going to file a separate lawsuit. And the Department of Justice objecting to the settlement. I don't think there's a high likelihood the Department of Justice will object to it. They may try to tweak it, because what NAR did in reaching this settlement was include all the things that the Department of Justice has been saying for the last couple of years they want NAR to do, including eliminating that participation rule. And so I think the Department of Justice will be on board, except for maybe some minor tweaking. So just so that you understand, this will go into effect mid to late July, even though the settlement will not have final approval, probably until the end of the year, sometime in December, we're expecting it. NAR has agreed to implement these changes, even if the settlement ultimately is rejected, because they know that they have problems, and they don't want to face any more lawsuits going forward. Now, I've been talking about the fact that you will not be able to put cooperating compensation on the MLS. But you will be allowed to have your seller offer cooperating compensation. You can do it on other websites. I think that there are websites like Zillow that are going to take advantage of this and post that information in order to enhance their bottom line. You can put it on your office website, printed material. You just can't do it on the MLS going forward. So what you're gonna have happen going forward is a lot of buyer's agents are gonna be calling, but the buyer can say, hey, I wanna know. You shouldn't be calling so that you can find out for yourself, where can I get the highest commission? But as we go through the agreement, I'll discuss a little bit, the buyer might be very concerned about, hey, I don't wanna have to pay your commission. I need to know that the seller's gonna cover whatever commission you, buyer's agent, and I, buyer, have agreed you're going to receive. And so you may wind up texting and emailing and calling the listing agent saying, is there any offer of compensation on this particular property from you or the seller? So that the buyer can make an informed decision whether or not they want to see that particular property. So that's the way you're going to find out most of them, unless Zillow, I keep using Zillow as an example, there are lots of websites, Realtor.com, etc. But unless one of the websites, creates a system whereby you can find that information. So that's going to be the world going forward. And one other part about the settlement that's important. Seller can include seller concessions in the MLS. It appears that seller concessions can include payment of the buyer agent's fees. Now, two other elements of the settlement, then we'll move on to the agreement, and I want your questions. One, the settlement specifically provides that whatever is agreed upon between the buyer's agent and the buyer in the written buyer agency agreement as the compensation for the buyer's agent. Let's say you agree with the buyer, I'll take 2%, just to pull out a number. As the payment for my services as the buyer's agent. You, as a buyer's agent, cannot receive any additional money from the seller. You're capped at that 2%. You've agreed you're providing services for 2%. You don't get a bonus if the seller is offering 2.5%. And one of the things in the agreement is that we say, if the seller is offering 2.5% in that example, that 0.5% goes to the buyer. Help the buyer to buy the house and move in. Yep. Stimulate, sales, in my opinion. Unless otherwise agreed in writing. So, but the bottom line is you can't accept any more. And then one of the questions, what about bonuses, or anything? No. It says you can't accept more than you've agreed to, for your services in that buyer agency agreement. So that's very important, okay? Let's go through the agreement a little bit. And I think those are the things, unless anybody has any questions about the lawsuit or anything I've said so far. God, either I was so clear or so vague. Nobody has questions? Wait, okay.
Hey, thank you so much for that information. This is Daisy Wagner with Keller Williams. So I know that MLSs won't have the option for listing agents to put the actual compensation, that whole section goes away. But can they add it in agent remarks, like buyer's broker's compensation offered or something, call for buyer's broker's, like something in agent's remarks? Agent remark, not the full remark, agent remark.
Yeah, it's a great question. The answer is no. You cannot put it in the agent remarks, any compensation. It cannot appear in the MLS as part of this settlement.
Is it just about not appearing or not paying? Because I'm confused. If you're saying not appearing, then
Barry, my name is Tom. I'm with Coldwell Banker in Princeton.
That makes sense to me.
One at a time.
Barry, this is Tom from Coldwell Banker in Princeton. If we have like an if then else kind of statement in our buyer's contract where it says we'll accept 2% if the buyer's paying our commission, but accept 2.5% if we get from the seller side, is that something that can be done, or is it just flat one price and you're done?
Boy, that is a great question. I gotta tell you, I've answered hundreds of questions and nobody's asked me that one before. So kudos. I'm gonna say that I think that would violate the spirit of the NAR settlement to do that, because the key is that there should be a fixed amount, not a variable amount in the buyer agency agreement. So, while there are certain issues that may need clarification from the NAR as we go forward, like this, my instinct, based upon the wording of the agreement, is that would not be allowed. A variable rate commission would not be allowed in a buyer agency agreement.
Gary Pele from Remax and Style. Why is it okay to list the offer of compensation in Zillow and other sources, but not the MLS?
That's right, that was the question. What are you trying to?
Why is that okay?
Why is it okay?
Okay, yeah, let me answer that question. I get some other people saying, yeah, great question. Okay, and it is. The reason being that the antitrust conspiracy that was alleged in the lawsuit was between NAR, the MLSs who were required to have, the space to offer compensation under the participation rule, and the big brokers, and it could be little brokers, but they went after the big boys, and the brokers who used the participation rule. That was the conspiracy among the three of them, if you will, or the agreement. It's an agreement or conspiracy in terms of the antitrust laws. Zillow, Realtor.com, those websites were not involved in lawsuits. And if Zillow or any other website now decided to post it, that would be okay. Because there's no agreement or conspiracy there, no requirement that they do it. The key here was that NAR required this over the years. If Zillow or any other website were to do it now, that's a unilateral decision. Any company, can do that. It's just like fixing prices. If two brokers said, you know what, we dominate this area. We dominate this shore area, Ocean County, we dominate this. Let's agree not to compete. And let's say, we're gonna charge 5% to every owner. Well, that's a conspiracy, an agreement to affect prices and fix prices that violates the antitrust laws. However, if each of those two brokers independently decided to charge 5%, that's okay. They're allowed to do it. So if Zillow, Realtor.com decide to post the cooperating brokerage commission, that's okay, as long as it's done independently.
But how would they get that information?
Barry, I'm Madeline Grubba, Callaway Henderson Sotheby's International Realty. It's a mouthful today. I wanted to ask you a question about line 65 on the buyer agency. It says other.
Let's wait until we go through the buyer agency agreement and ask that when we're going through it. Is that okay?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, thanks. But line 65, wait a second, what is that, line 65? Okay.
Hi Mary, this is Gio with Better Homes and Gardens. Could you touch base on dual agency? I know there's some talk about we can't accept from both sides. Then if we are a dual agent, are we working for the buyer for free?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's a real estate commission regulation, for those of you who are not aware of it, which says that where there's dual agency, the broker has to be paid by either the buyer or the seller. It cannot be paid partially by the buyer and partially by the seller. You can't have dual compensation where there's dual agency. It has to be paid by one or the other. It's a real complication, because it has not been an issue up until now, because typically the seller pays. And so you have dual agency, who cares? The seller's paying the broker as a dual agent, it's not being partially paid by buyer, partially by seller. You're gonna have more and more buyers now paying the commission, and so you run afoul of that rule, that regulation. If the buyer's paying the buyer's agent, who becomes a dual agent, and the seller's paying the listing agent, who now is a dual agent. Can't do it. So it's a real problem. I'm gonna tell you, New Jersey is the only state in the country that has such I was gonna use the word asinine, we shouldn't use that, right? Such a ridiculous rule. There's no basis for it, no reason for it. I will also tell you that New Jersey Realtors is working on legislation that'll do away with that, to eliminate that regulation. When I spent the last 2 days, working on that legislation, and the last 4 months, actually working on that legislation to get it up to speed, and it's going to, and assuming it gets passed, I'm expecting it'll be introduced within the next couple of weeks. And I was we're working with the Office of Legislative Services now, fine tuning it. But the long and the short of it, that legislation, just to give you a heads up, is going to, as I said, do away with that real estate commission regulation, which I think has no basis and shouldn't be there. It'll require buyer agency agreements for all real estate licensees in New Jersey. So it's not just going to be realtors, members of NAR who are going to be required to have buyer agency agreements. And it's going to do lots of other things in New Jersey, assuming that it gets passed, as we expect that it will. So stay tuned in terms of that. Any other questions before I move on to the agreement itself?
Yes, I have one. Chris Vasili with Next Level Realty. I wanted to ask a question about piggybacking off this one about dual agency, but also with unrepresented parties. Do you think there's going to be a place for an unrepresented parties form, whether you're representing the buyer or the seller, and then the other party comes in, you've already got the agreement, you're in what would be a dual agency relationship, but break out of that,
Sure,
that relationship.
great question. Oops, sorry.
We're good.
Yeah, the unrepresented party, and that often will happen. It'll happen in an open house, it can happen under circumstances. Buyer comes in and says, I'm not represented, and you're the listing agent. You have a choice at that point. Are you going to become a dual agent or continue just to represent the seller in the transaction? It's not going to be any different than it is now. Because think about it, if the party's unrepresented, that's okay. You just said, hey, I'm not representing you, I'm only representing the seller in this transaction. I'll deal honestly and fairly with you, but I'm not representing you. Let's be clear about that. And that's perfectly fine, whether it's an open house or any other situation. That's allowed. Or you can choose to become a dual agent, in which case you do not have to get the buyer agency agreement signed. That is a key issue that I'm asked all the time. If the buyer is going to become a dual agent, there's no requirement for buyer agency agreement. It's only where you're going to be a buyer's agent representing the buyer, not a dual agent under the settlement and under the legislation proposed by New Jersey Realtors. So let's be clear on that. That's an important issue.
Yes.
That if it's going to become dual agency, you do not need a buyer agency agreement.
So when we
Any other questions?
explain that.
One last question.
When we say dual agency, when we say dual
But I
agency,
can't hear, there's a lot of chatter.
when we say dual agency or disclosed dual agency, aren't we talking about the agency? For example, if I'm EXP, then EXP is the agency. That means any other EXP agent is a disclosed dual agent.
You know what, I'm unable to understand that. There was a little feedback, maybe if somebody.
Yeah, the question, Barry,
can say it.
yeah, the question is that, let's say that there's an EXP agent that's, is on one side, and another EXP is on the other side. In essence, that's dual agency. So how is that handled?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. And sorry I couldn't understand when you asked it. Here's what I'm going to suggest. We have a dual agency situation right now. If you're the buyer's agent, I would suggest and work this out ahead of time with your buyer, that you include in the offer submitted to the seller, that the seller pay the entire commission, whether as a concession or however it works out, but that way, only one party is paying the dual agent. And that's the way you really have to do it if you want compensation. That also can be in the listing agreement, by the way. And that's probably the easier place to put it. If the listing agent, another agent from that listing agent's office, or the listing agent, becomes a dual agent, the seller will pay the entire commission. That can be in the listing agreement. And that would be a great way to handle it until such time as the legislation that I'm expecting will be passed in the next couple of months goes into effect.
Okay, let's move on to the buyer agency agreement, and then we'll have more questions after.
Sounds good. Oops. Just lost it. There we go. Okay, I'm just gonna highlight, some of the things in here, because we actually touched upon a number of the aspects of the buyer agency agreement. And just while they're getting it up on the screen, I just want you to know, the only thing that New Jersey Realtors has put out so far is an exclusive buyer agency agreement. There will be a revised non-exclusive buyer agency agreement and an exclusive buyer agency agreement with rebates to the buyer, if that's your office's policy, and non-exclusive with rebates. There historically, since 2001, have been 4 separate buyer agency agreements on New Jersey's website for you to use. I've been advocating using them ever since I prepared it back in 2001. Now you're gonna have to use it, you won't have any choice, but do know that there will be additional buyer agency agreements to be posted, but we thought it was most important, get out the exclusive one, because 95% of the buyer agency agreements you're gonna get signed are gonna be exclusive. You want an exclusive one. If you run into a buyer says, I want non-exclusive, I wanna work with you a little bit, some other broker, use the non-exclusive buyer agency agreement that's online to sign them up. So just so you know, that'll be coming down the road. Okay, let's just, key thing in the first paragraph, it talks about, that you're going to be the exclusive buyer agent in a particular area. You and the buyer define the area. I don't care whether that area is Ocean County, it's Princeton, it's Cape May. You fill in the area. If nothing's filled in, then it's New Jersey, it's the default. Now also realize that you may run into buyers who say, I don't want to be tied to you, I'm not sure, but I want you to show me this house. You can fill in a particular property in there. And then you're the exclusive buyer agent for that particular property. And you may say to them, you know what? You want me to show you 3 houses. We'll fill in there the 3 locations. And I suspect by the time I show you those 3 houses, you're going to want to sign an exclusive with me for the entire area. But I'll show you these 3 houses. And so you can use that to build up to getting an exclusive for a territory sometimes. So that's the key as far as I'm concerned. First paragraph, I'm going to skip way down because there's nothing really that's particularly necessary. Down to the bottom, the termination. Because I want to make sure that you understand that this agreement is going to be, they'll be able to terminate it on 3 days notice, written notice. But you can terminate it too. I'll tell you, the old agreements that we had only allowed the buyer to terminate. Now you can terminate too, because I've had so many calls from brokers saying, Barry, we have the buyer from hell, we have the seller from hell, we want to terminate our relationship. You should be allowed to terminate it too. Now, you of course can vary that if you cross that out and have everybody initial and put on 30 days notice, but I think 3 days notice is reasonable. If the relationship's not working out, you want to move on to another buyer. And if they want to move on to another agent, fine. The key, as far as I'm concerned, is that if it's terminated, go to the next page. Paragraph 2 there, down in the middle. If within blank days after the expiration of this agreement, it's terminated, okay, after the expiration of this agreement, you will have the opportunity to send a list of those properties you introduced to that buyer. And you will be protected with regard to those properties. So even if the buyer says, I'm terminating this on 3 days notice, you're gonna send a list to that buyer. These are the properties I'm protecting. I showed you these properties. I introduced these properties to you. And if you enter into another agreement with somebody else, I'm protected as to these. And that paragraph says that the buyer has an obligation to provide that list to the new buyer, to the new agent that is signing them. And that if they don't provide that list, they may be obligated for 2 commissions. One to you for having introduced